All right, this story comes from Huffington Post. This is very interesting to me. Trump judge blocks overtime pay for 4 million workers. On Friday, a federal judge in Texas struck down a new rule from the Biden administration aimed at extending overtime protections to millions of workers. The overtime rule is one of the furthest reaching economic reforms that President Joe Biden has pursued unilaterally through the federal rulemaking process. It would dramatically expand the share of workers who are entitled to time and a half pay when they work more than 40 hours in a week. So did you ever have a job, Cecil? I was thinking about this earlier today. Did you ever have a job that moved you into a salary position and you could tell the reason that they did it was to avoid paying you overtime and to work you more hours?
Luckily, I never had to worry about that. Any job that I worked overtime in, I got overtime pay that I worked in my life. I never had a job that I was an hourly person and I was working so many hours that they turned to me and said, you know what, we're going to make you a salaried person. That's never happened to me.
Do you know that that's happened most of my adult life?
I imagine it. I recognize in the industry you're in and the hours I know you used to work that probably happened.
Yeah. I just real quick, when I worked so when you're in sales is excluded from overtime pay, even if you're hourly. Sales is just excluded categorically from overtime pay. So there's a variety of professions that are excluded from the federal overtime pay rules. So when I was in sales, I worked a lot of hours and I never got paid any overtime for any of those hours because in sales, you're automatically excluded. And then when I got my first job in the industry that I'm in now, I was promoted to manager in 6 months. And I was a very young guy and I had just barely gotten there. And they promoted me to be manager in 6 months, even though I had really no authority and I really had no employees, because it was a way for them to make sure that they didn't have to pay me a fucking dollar of overtime.
Sure, yeah.
And then when I got to the other company, I moved from that company to another one. I got a job. I wasn't in a managerial spot and again got promoted within a handful of months into a managerial role with no real authority and not a lot of people working under me, at least initially, because I was working a fucking million hours and it was a way for them to avoid paying me overtime.
Yeah.
I don't know that I've ever gotten a dollar of overtime pay in my life. I don't know that I ever have gotten, because I don't think I've ever had a full-time job. Now that I think about it, I don't know that I've ever had a full-time job where I've gotten paid overtime.
Sure.
Where I've qualified for it.
Yeah.
The rulemaking process really was to say, okay, people who are making less than a certain dollar amount, they got to get paid overtime.
Yeah.
You got to pay these guys overtime. You can't do this bullshit where you're paying somebody $25 an hour or the equivalent thereof, $40,000, $50,000 a year. And then you're going to say, oh, you don't get paid overtime because you're this category of exempt employee, but you don't get paid more. You're categorically exempt in some bullshit way. But that means that we can work you 50, 60, 70, 80 hours a week. And it doesn't cost us the company anymore. And they changed the rule. And they're just like these judges that absolutely do legislate from the bench that crazily, Cecil, they always find authority when they want to vote against stuff like this, right? It's always exceeding the government's authority when they want to vote against stuff, when they want to rule against stuff like this, right? But like the president has unlimited other authorities, right? The president has like virtually unlimited law-breaking authority, for example.
Yeah.
But he can't like make a rule that we actually pay people a decent wage. It's amazing how that works.
If the government should do anything, it should regulate that workers are not exploited. If the government does anything, right? I don't care who you are. I don't care what brand of American you are, whether that's libertarian or that's conservative or that's, it's liberal or left or whatever, or tanky, whatever. You don't want to see a group of people getting exploited by their boss, by their company. If the system does anything, it should be to protect those people, right? And instead, what we're doing is we're creating a system that then has this one simple trick to get your employees to work unlimited hours and you don't have to pay them. Like all that shit is dumb loophole shit that shouldn't be in there. If you can't afford to hire employees and pay them a regular wage and have them do work at the hours that are requested, and they get that wage from you. If you can't afford that and you have to do some kind of crazy loophole in order to fix that so that they are stuck doing massive amounts of work for not as much pay, that should be the time where the government steps in and says, maybe you shouldn't have a job. Maybe you shouldn't have a business. Maybe you shouldn't be exploiting these people.
Dude, I agree. This should be like a central function of government, right? Is to protect us for this. Also, it should be the case that overtime should be something that a company uses as an exception and not something that a company uses because it's fucking free because they reclassified their employees.
Yep.
If you're paying time and a half, when I manage people, I'm very acutely aware of my overtime line because I know every hour of overtime, unless I'm using it only in a peak season, is bad management. Like if I'm off peak season and I'm spending a huge amount of money on overtime, I don't have enough people. I don't have enough staff. I've managed this poorly, and now I'm paying everybody 50% more for the same labor I could be getting if I staffed my people properly. But if you reclass all your employees so that now you don't have to pay them overtime.
Yeah.
Then why would you ever staff appropriately?
Yeah,
you can run them like fucking animals.
Yeah, you can work them like dogs. And we have labor laws in this country very specifically to try to prevent against that. But this is an example of conservative justices ruling on the side of the ruling class, ruling on the side of the business class, ruling on the side of the elite, and it's attacking workers. And this is a Trump appointed judge. And make no mistake, Trump ran on no taxing on overtime, right? He ran on that. No tax on overtime was this big thing that he was talking about for much of his campaign. Well, that's because there's this weird, simple trick where you don't have to pay overtime. So he can fucking make a promise that that no one ever has to give the government because there doesn't have to be any overtime pay for those people.
Yeah, we won't tax you on the money we don't pay you. How magnanimous of us.
Yeah.
Hey, look, I'm not going to tax you at all on the money I didn't give you. Oh, wow. Let me go ahead and show up and fucking vote for you because I'm stupid.